The president gives an impassioned speech on voting rights. This as two voting rights bills, filibuster changes, and infrastructure proposals are all on the table in the Senate with only a few weeks to go before the August recess. Joining us to talk about all that and more is Illinois Senior Senator Dick Durbin. Senator Durbin, welcome to Chicago tonight as always. I want to start with Texas lawmakers, Democrats specifically. They are on the lam from their state to prevent that legislature from voting on restrictions, from passing voting restrictions. Meanwhile, President Biden is also turning up the national debate on a voting rights speech that he gave today in Philadelphia. Take a look.
There's an unfolding assault taking place in America today, an attempt to suppress and subvert the right to vote and fair and free elections. An assault on democracy.
Senator Durbin, two bills, voting rights bills in the Senate that would counter what the president says is an assault on democracy. Do they have any chance of going anywhere?
No. At this point, there's no indication the Republicans will support either one. Let's face it, the demographics are not on the side of the Republican Party. The only way that they can engineer victories in the future is by districts drawn carefully, and secondly, by suppressing the vote of those who are going to vote against them. And that's what they set out to do. If it were a random state here or there, you'd say there's no pattern. But there is a pattern. There's over 20 states where Republicans dominate the legislature, where they're finding ways to reduce the opportunity for people who are eligible, reduce the opportunity for them to vote. That is a conscious design, and I'm very sorry to see it happen.
And when you say no, it seems to indicate to me that you don't believe that Senator Joe Manchin, Senator Kristen Sinema will change their stance on the filibuster, which would eliminate the need for 10 Republican votes.
Well, they're not the only ones. They've stated it clearly and publicly where they stand. I think I understand where they are. There are other senators who have misgivings too, and many are saying, all right, fine, if I'm for eliminating the filibuster, what then is the Senate all about, and how will the rules work? You know, you really have to sit down and write a rules book or create a rules committee like the House. It just doesn't end overnight without complications.
Sounds like you think that would be a slippery slope then.
Well, it's a challenge. I will tell you, I'm as frustrated as anybody. 20 years ago, I introduced the DREAM Act. Most people know what that's all about. Young people brought to this country, a chance for them to become American citizens. I've lost it on the floor of the Senate five times to the filibuster. So I know what the filibuster is all about, and I know that issues like immigration and civil rights and human rights turn out to be the major topics and major targets.
So if the Senate isn't going to take up these bills, is there any other action that can be taken to assuage the nerves of Democrats at watching some of these state legislatures pass voter restrictions?
No, and I will tell you, the Supreme Court a week or two ago in their Brnovich decision reiterated the fact that they have a very expansive view. Justice Alito wrote the opinion, an expansive view when it comes to limitations on voting. And I just think they're flat out wrong, and reflects a very conservative court and one that may reflect today's Republican Party.
Speaking of the court, Senator, you are chairman of the Judiciary Committee. There's been some talk about Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer. He is one of the three liberal members of the court. Do you believe he should retire in the next year, given that Democrats have the Senate and they would be able to perhaps confirm a replacement short of the midterms?
The last thing you're going to get me quoted on is pressuring Stephen Breyer to retire. I am not going to do that. I want him to make up his own mind, and I think outside pressure is counterproductive.
All right, let's move on to other policy. The president had touted a bipartisan agreement on about $1 trillion infrastructure package. It seems like some of the GOP support right now is wavering. What is the status of that right now?
I just talked to one of my colleagues who is sitting in on the actual sessions where they're writing the bill, and he feels very positive that it's going to be done. And a lot of the questions that are being raised about Republicans not sticking with the bill and for a variety of reasons, he said he hasn't heard any of that. So I think that may be manufactured. At this point, I believe there are at least 10, maybe more now, Republicans willing to join Democrats in a good, strong bipartisan infrastructure bill.
And do you think some of the specifics of that agreement might change? I mean, it was about $1 trillion, give or take, the last we heard. No tax increases on higher earners, as the president had wanted, either for that or and some of the human infrastructure bills that he wanted. So what might change about the bill to get it past the finish line?
So here are the three things to recall. The Biden infrastructure bill was much larger, but virtually every item that is now in the bipartisan bill was part of the Biden bill. So the White House approved that. Secondly, the mechanism to pay for it has been agreed to by the Republicans and by the Democrats with the White House. And third, I think there are a lot of people, particularly a dozen Republicans, who would like to see bipartisan measures passing in the Senate. I would agree with that goal.
The minority leader, Mitch McConnell, has said he doesn't want to exactly help along the Biden agenda. Do you think he would be a roadblock to keeping some of these Republican senators on board?
Harris, you understated his position dramatically. He said he was 100% opposed to the Biden agenda. He comes to the floor every day begging Republicans not to vote with Joe Biden on anything. It's the same thing he did to Barack Obama, where he said, I want to be a one-term president. But there are some Republicans who believe that just showing up here and voting no on everything is not a very good way to get this country moving again. I hope they'll stick with it and join us in a bipartisan effort.
All right, let's move on to this summit on violence that the president had yesterday that featured Chicago Police Superintendent David Brown. Let's hear what David Brown said about it.
Programs with young people, jobs, street outreach, violence interrupters. I mean, the whole ecosystem, not just the enforcement piece. That's one part of it. I mean, the most dangerous people need to be taken off the streets. That's clearly our focus from a law enforcement perspective, but there's an ecosystem here that we all have to focus on. This is not going to be a mass incarceration effort. We know that didn't work.
So, Senator, President Biden and Attorney General Merrick Garland have talked about increased assistance for violence in the form of joint federal and local strike forces to go after illegal gun dealers. Is there anything different about this plan that hasn't been proposed by past attorneys generals and presidents?
Here's the difference. The difference is the Congress, through the American Rescue Plan of President Biden, without a single Republican voting in favor of it in the House or the Senate, has sent dramatic amounts of money to the states and local units of government. And what Joe Biden said yesterday is, I hope that you'll consider taking a portion of that and spending it on what the superintendent just described, not just the tools of law enforcement, but also community intervention, crisis intervention in the lives of young people. The things that we know get to the heart of why someone joins a gang and shoots an innocent person. That, I think, is a realistic approach, because we've sent the resources to the local level to make it work.
And that's something that City Council has been debating. But on the gun part, I mean, can the Justice Department go after illegal gun sales more forcefully than previous Justice Departments have?
The president has said he wants that to happen. I hope he can make it happen, because I just want to be very candid with you. There is no meaningful gun legislation that's going to pass in the United States Senate. It's a 50-50 Senate. We know where both parties are aligned, and I don't see any change in the offing.
Speaking about safety and violence, we hear that the fencing has come down around the Capitol for the first time in 6 months after the January 6th insurrection. How are you feeling about your safety and the safety of lawmakers and staff members at the Capitol?
I feel good about it, and I will tell you, I think most members of Congress do too. What a sad day that was on January 6th. That was a day from a congressional viewpoint that will live in infamy in terms of what that Trump-inspired insurrectionist mob did to us in the United States Capitol. Hundreds of them have now been charged with crimes. Thank goodness. They ought to be held accountable for what they did on that day. In terms of what they'll do in the future, I wish we'd put together the bipartisan commission that Pelosi and Schumer suggested, but McConnell's against it. I'd like to get to the bottom of what these white supremacy and nationalist groups had to do with financing and planning January 6th.
And presumably that's part of what the FBI is investigating as well. I want to get to some local state politics. The FEC just put out a ruling today regarding Congresswoman Robin Kelly. She's a person that you were instrumental in getting to replace Mike Madigan as chairperson of the Illinois Democratic Party. But the FEC is now saying because she's a federal office holder, she cannot be involved in any fundraising for state or local races. does that hamper her ability to lead the party, since that's a big function of the job?
Well, I want to read the FEC opinion because we made an offer to them on her behalf that she would not be involved in state and local fundraising, that she would confine any of her fundraising to the federal side. And let me just add quickly, for all of the pluses of Chairman Madigan, he did not really dole out money beyond his own Illinois House when it came to campaigns to a great extent. So we think if we can work with Robin and the FEC, that she can play the role we want her to play as a spokesman for our party, but also we can find fundraising opportunities that totally comply with the law.
And as I understand, that ruling is saying that the party has to form a special independent committee to do that kind of fundraising, which I think is some of the things that you were proposing.
That's exactly what we proposed. And let me tell you, that is not an outlandish approach. I've been involved in fundraising at many different levels, and I've been confined in my fundraising by the same federal laws that guided their decision. And there's just a limit to what we can do. But I know that Robin wants to be compliant with the law, and she took the case to the FEC to get a ruling to base her own administration on.
All right, Senator Dick Durbin, we thank you as always for joining us.
Thank you, too.